So without further ado, I'll make a start then. And obviously, the topic for today is thinking about how we can increase our impact as data analysts in relation to driving business value. And I think this is probably the most abstract of all the principles that, to learn as data analysts. And often it's really hard to know what it that looks like without having worked in industry. And so obviously what we've been doing as the facilitators is pulling together all of our experience and trying to distill that into some easily digestible concepts that we can pass on to you, and that will hopefully supercharge your development when you come to work in industry. Right. So I wanted to start with a question. And the question that I want to ask you, and please document your thoughts in the Q&A or chat function, is what do you think it takes to be a successful data analyst? So here I'm thinking about the kind of core skills that you might see on a job description, or even the sort of soft skills, right, that you might be expected to demonstrate at interview and therefore be successful in the role. So what do you think it is that we look for? There we go. I'm getting a few intuition. That's for a concept. Speed, attention to detail. I think that's a really massive one. Because obviously, data is a very finicky business and it pays to be very detail oriented to make sure that our products work as intended. Absolutely critical thinking is a massive one, Martha. I think it applies to any role really, but the ability to not only think about the technical outputs, but how it relates to the business. Asking the correct questions, I think that's a really great one too, because ultimately it's all about that connection to the stakeholders and making sure that the product that we deliver is asking the right questions and answering, what is meant to be, delivered against, right? So getting a few other suggestions is really good. Identifying patterns, business understanding. I think we're all hitting the right points, which is great. So what I'm going to do is show you now my definition of what I think it takes to be a good data analyst. And so this is drawn from mostly this angle of thinking about what it takes to drive business value. And it's that connection of the two principles that we've just outlined. So thinking about technical skills, so the ability to translate data into actionable insights. So big emphasis on the word actionable here, because ultimately we have a user, someone is using the end product of our analysis and it needs to be easy for them to understand, right? But then also, and underscoring this point, to create business value. And so this is essentially the nugget that I really want to focus on in the rest of this masterclass today, about how do we know what this is? How can we think about the tools that we can use as data analysts that enable us to get this thinking right, and ultimately, to drive value for whoever our customers are. Okay, so I'm just going to go over a little bit about the structure before we launch into all the topics. There's a lot to cover here, so I'm really excited to be able to share all of this with you. And I think also I'm going to be doing periodic pauses throughout the descriptions. And so if you do have questions, I'm happy to answer them, throughout. I'll just make some periodic pauses after each subsection. And then obviously what I'll do is save some time for questions at the end for anyone that wants to get into more of a discussion. So first of all, what we're going to start off with is a case study. So this case study is based on one of the data sets that those that are currently working on the program will have experience in, and thinking about an example problem that we might need to solve as data analysts and how do we go about structuring that thought process. The second part is obviously thinking about how do we frame our analysis in a way that can be understood by our stakeholders. And then thinking about, once we have our framed view, how do we then move towards creating outputs that, whether those are technical dashboards or reports that strike a chord with our audience, and toolkits that will help us to do that. And then we'll move on to some kind of storytelling techniques that you can implement in presentations or even in reports, whether that's written or verbal, right? And thinking about simplifying the kind of potentially complex analysis that you've done into concepts that will drive discussion, right? And then finally thinking about the recommendations. So as many of you that are on the course will find out, or that will already know, I'm sure, is that thinking about the business recommendations that you are trying to influence at the end of your project or presentation is a really important end goal to have in mind, even throughout your analysis, even when you start your presentation prep. And so this is something that we'll definitely talk about at the end and do some interactive exercises. All right. So without further ado, I'll make a start. So the first thing that we're going to be going through is a case study. And so I just want to walk you through this so that, we understand, what's being asked of us, and we can work through, these toolkits that I mentioned, right? So I'm just going to read through this with you. So if you read along with me, and then we can talk about, what does it mean? So this is an example scenario that is based on, in fact, for those of you that are astute and have read the current students that are currently on the program, this is based on the first assignment that you will have been working on throughout, your first 4 weeks. But obviously, we're using a different data set here and asking slightly different questions, but you'll see the similarities. So you're a data analyst and you're working with a company called Chinook, and they are a transactional online digital media store, sort of like Spotify, right? And they help, essentially they sell tracks online to a wide customer base. And our goal here as an analyst is to help them understand purchase behavior from the customers in order to hopefully increase sales, create marketing initiatives, that sort of thing, and reduce business risk. And they have given us 3 target areas that they're interested in. And so this will help us to kind of frame our analysis. And so the first is customer demographics. The second, what genres of music seem to sell best? And if that varies based on the demographics that we will analyze. And then thirdly, a slightly more abstract one is thinking about business risk, where given that you might have several artists that drive the majority of revenue on a platform, are there any, how do we know how exposed we are as a business to those artists? So for example, like Neil Young, he dropped off Spotify a few years ago, just because, he didn't agree with the ethics of the label. And as a result, there was significant exposure to Spotify through that decision. And so this sort of thing can happen quite often in business settings. So it's important to know how we can, support the business in order to think about how to manage that risk. Okay, so hopefully you've understood that. We'll keep referring back to it. Now I wanted to draw in this concept of the data. So we've got the sort of business ask, right? We've got this is the business ask, and we know that there's these 3 areas: demographics, genres, and business risk. Now I want to just briefly talk about the data that we have available to us. So as I mentioned, those that have done the Chinook exercise in the current cohort, I'm sure this will be familiar to you. This is an ERD. Essentially, that stands for an entity relationship diagram. And all this is a representation of all the data in the Chinook warehouse, right? And so this is a data model. Essentially, you can see that there are several rectangles. Each rectangle has a blue kind of strip, which signifies the title. And each rectangle is an entity. So an entity means like a concrete concept that is different to the other entities. So thinking about, tracks and selling music online, we can think of concepts, right? So things like an artist, albums, tracks, all of these things, we typically tend to store as separate tables, and that just helps with the efficiency of storage and being able to update tables without causing big dependency chains further on in the analytics process. So this is just an easy way to manage it. But obviously, when we look at this for the first time, it can be really scary. So I just want to go through a couple of things here. So obviously, we have some important tables, and I want to think about those business objectives that we've just been thinking about. So one of those was demographics. So can anyone in the chat point out some example demographic fields that might be interesting for our analysis as we go through this? So demographics are typically things relating to the customer, right? About personal information or where they're from, that sort of thing. So I'll wait for this to come through. But as we run through it, there's other things that we want to talk about here as well. So what you might notice is that each table has a blue field that relates to a primary key. And essentially all this is a unique identifier. So for example, if we have track ID, if we look at the track table, track ID is the primary key. All that means is that we can't have a duplicate ID. So the idea of this is that we don't want to sell two versions of exactly the same track or represent that in our database, because that causes duplication and ultimately that causes potential problems further down the line in our reporting. So that's what you'll see in blue. And then when you look at the different links to the other tables, what you'll see is that you have also these bold titles here, which are called foreign keys. And all a foreign key is a linking field to another table. So you can see, for example, media type is a unique key in the media type table, but then in the tracks table, it is a foreign key. And all that means is that we can link to that information. So what I really want to get the key concept here is just thinking about when you look at this for the first time, because typically in a business setting, this is what the sort of information that you'll be given as an analyst is just thinking about, okay, well, what information do I have from the business about the sorts of things they want me to investigate? And what information is there in the data that I can use to investigate this problem? I'm just going to quickly have a check to the demographics question they answered before. So I'm seeing lots of good suggestions. So country is a big one. City, again, things like the customer, gender, all of these are very good. Yes, so these are things that we might want to consider as areas of investigation, right, when we come to do our exploratory analysis. So this is why it's really helpful to understand the metadata or the structure of the tables so that we can link these business broad concepts, right, to concrete analytical details that we can use. So this is a key theme that I want us to bear in mind as we go through these exercises. Okay, so what have we done? We've just looked at the business scenario, and we know that we're looking for information about customer demographics, the genres and albums that are currently being sold and whether those are best selling or not. And then finally, the kind of business risk angle of, do we have a significant exposure to several artists that are selling loads of albums? And if one of them goes, maybe we will be exposed as a business. Keeping that in mind, let's think about how do we then go from these sorts of concepts, right? We've got a link between the analysis and the business objectives, but we want to solidify this in a way that will convince stakeholders that we have an understanding of the business problem and a way of finding a solution based in data, right? So I think before beginning any work in any industry project, I think it's really, really important to be able to deeply understand the business problem. So in real life, obviously what you would be doing is, similar to the suggestions that you guys mentioned before, meeting with the key stakeholders, talking to, for example, the data team. Imagine if you're a contractor coming in to a new organization for the first time, and so you're trying to understand the landscape of the data that you're working with. So absolutely, you're going to be having these sorts of conversations, setting up workshops, speaking to the customer, so like the senior responsible owner of the project, and ultimately trying to get buy-in for your approach, right? And the need for, delivering on the project plan and, creating that action. And obviously, when we come to the assignment in concrete in relation to the Career Accelerator that you're on, the difference between real life and assignments is that obviously one is a case study and the other is real life. And so in real life, you'll be able to talk to people and so on. In case studies, you don't, because obviously it's a theoretical exercise rooted in real data. So in place of talking to the business, what I really recommend that you all do is think about the problem-solving framework that essentially allows you to evidence your interpretation of the business problem. And it's that evidencing your thought process and framing the analysis in relation to the business priorities, linking it to your analytical objectives. That is the really key step to making your analysis persuasive, right? Because ultimately, it's that link that we really want to make as firm as possible of the questions we're answering of the data and the value that it's giving to the business. And if we can keep that really firmly in mind throughout our analysis, we will have a very impactful, data story by the end of it. So I'll talk on some of these problem-solving frameworks in a bit, but I know for those students currently on the program, you will have covered that in week one. So these are things like fishbone and 5 whys that you talked about. And so these are things that we'll be looking for when it comes to writing up your assignments for the deadline. All right. So yeah, speaking about problem-solving frameworks, I've just given you an example of how I have used one of these in relation to the scenario that we've been given in this case study. So this is an example of a fishbone diagram. And all this really is an attempt for me as an analyst coming in without having any conversations with real people, because it's a case study, of looking at the scenario and the data set and trying to demonstrate a link to, what my interpretation is of the business problem. So in the fishbone diagram, you can see I've got 4 different stages. I'm thinking about the different sort of stakeholders and realms within an organization. And so this, adds realism to my interpretation, right? So thinking about the business problem, why have we been asked to undertake this work is because ultimately at the moment, Chinook doesn't have a good understanding of who its customers are. And the demographic profiling isn't, being taken advantage of. We're not using this in any way where we could, for example, attract more customers or encourage more sales through targeted, for example, marketing. And then obviously thinking about the link from the customers and then to the product, we thought about not just understanding customer graphics, but thinking about which genres are best selling and seeing if we can link that to demographics and therefore create some targeted campaigning. And then ultimately thinking about, well, how can data help us to understand and drive business value here? Is that thinking about the risk, tying that to the third question, is that really we don't have an understanding of how exposed we are, and we need to have some sort of backup plan in case some of our big sellers decide to move labels, right? So thinking about how we can link that to artists' share of sales, and essentially just drawing this all together into like a more concrete view of our interpretation of a problem. And then so on, I talked about marketing and sales. And so the main thing about this is I want to see that thought process in understanding the root problem. So this is almost doing the work that you would be doing in real life by talking to stakeholders. So this problem solving framework really helps to draw a concrete link to your from your interpretation to the analysis that you'll do. So again, I'll just leave that there for now, but certainly something to look at. Again, if you have any more questions, then I'm happy to ask them. I can put them down in the chat. So imagine we've defined our problem-solving framework. We've used one of these tools like the 5 whys or fishbone, and we've delivered, a more structured view of how we think we're going to tie the analysis to answering the business problem. And now we're ready to write a problem-solving statement. And all a problem-solving statement is essentially a way of hooking your audience to the value that your analysis is producing. So what does this do? I think this is really, really useful before I even go into how you construct one. It's really useful to start a presentation in this way, or even like the introduction of a technical report, because ultimately it allows you to contextualize your analysis in the problem that needs to be solved, and therefore get buy-in that what you're doing is on the right mark and engage stakeholders in the right way. So how do we actually construct one? So I've got this 3-step framework that I think will be useful for you guys to employ when you come to either present in a business setting or for the assignments that you'll produce on the Career Accelerator. So the first step is to declare the problem. So what does that mean? In relation to the Chinook exercise, we can say something like, Chinook is facing a problem of stagnating sales and hindered by, poor understanding of customer purchase behavior. And so that's just taking a little bit from the assignment, about the questions that it's asking us and the context that we've been given to make a stance on why they've asked us to do this project. Step 2 is then stating the urgency. And essentially, this is the hook, right? So, we've got our context now by declaring the problem. Why does this need to be solved? And why does it need to be solved now? And so studying this urgency will help to hook, obviously, your audience into the importance of the work you're doing. And so an example of this could be, to remain competitive, Chinook needs to identify the high value customer groups, for increasing their sales base and understanding its product risk profile. That could be one example. And then finally, linking it to your analysis. And obviously, this is the crux here. So we've set some context, we've defined why it's important. And now what we need to do is link the work that we're going to do to that understanding of solving the problem. And this is what I'm going to talk about a little bit more right now. So I'm going to go through some examples here about how I've approached it. Obviously, this is not necessarily the golden answer. This is just me as an analyst approaching this from a kind of logical framework view. But I'm hoping that as we go through this, you'll see that that has some explanatory power that then unpacks your analysis in a way that is, understandable to someone that's looking at it for the first time. Okay, so you can see this is an example problem solving statement where I've basically taken the bullet point that I just read you out. And this is, where you declare the problem, to then relate it back to the urgency of why it needs to be solved now is, that we're currently, losing money by not identifying these customers that are high value and not understanding our risk profile. And the third point, which is what I want to mention, is then how do we link it to the analysis? We essentially want to construct analytical objectives that link the data set to the business scenario. So how can we think about this? So again, if we remind ourselves back to the business scenario of those three questions that we were thinking about at the start, the first one is about customer demographics. The second one was about linking those demographics to genres and best-selling genres or artists. And then the third was about the risk profile. So questions to ask ourselves before we even construct our analytical objectives is, okay, well, what information is available? We've already done that. Can we segment customers by other quantitative metrics? I mean, that's an interesting one. So thinking about, is it just product sales that we're interested in? Or are we looking at other metrics in the database? And obviously that would be something that you do when you're looking at your ERD. And then finally think about which fields most strongly relate to the business objective. And so let's take a look. So if we think about our theme one, ideally what we want to do is show the business that we're addressing each theme systematically. So we've got a customer objective. Let's think about how we can create a solid analytical objective that links customer demographics to the data set. Okay. So if you look at the table here, I've identified the theme. And if I just take the case study content, the demographics of their customers, which is literally verbatim from the case study that I just read you out, is this a valid objective? And obviously I put a big red cross here. And the reason it's not valid is because this is not measurable, right? We don't know. If we just say the demographics, we want to investigate the demographics of the customer base in a presentation, that's not measurable. And we want to find a way that we can make this related back to the scenario in a way that's impactful. And so an example of a way that we can construct this is, by identifying those key fields that we're looking at in the database and, by constructing it in a way that adds impact and relates to the scenario. So I've said here, we want to identify the size and average spend of customer base by country. And you can see I've highlighted in bold. I'll talk about this in a bit to inform the prioritization of resources for future marketing campaigns. So in black, we've got, metrics from our database. So we've got size, the number, average spend, the, amount of money that is spent by its customers, segmenting that by country, right, in order to achieve some sort of business objective. And so here you can see I'm combining all these little things into one concrete statement that then links the analysis to the business objective. And so whilst, this is, one of many valid objectives, ultimately it's measurable And that's the quantitative criteria that we want to adhere to, when we come to present or deliver a technical report, because we want to show that we can measure that success. Okay. Thinking about the second one, so let's just walk through this systematically again. So in the case study, the content that we were given was which genres sell best, and can we understand that by demographic? We get a little bit more. So obviously, selling best, that seems to be a key concept for some of the stakeholders. But then how can we still, this isn't good enough in its own to hold up as something that can be measured. So we need to be a bit more precise about how we define this when we come to present or when we come to write our reports. And an example of how you could do this is obviously taking from the text, find the best-selling genre, compare the popularity across the different customer countries in order so that we can determine what regional preferences might exist and therefore support the delivery of tailored marketing, as an example. Right. So this is getting from, a non-data view of the idea of like not understanding anything about our customer demographics or individual preferences to an idea that we can understand preferences and we can market and deliver hopefully strategies that will increase the retention or sales of our customers through the use of data that we already have. And so thinking about that, the use of those keywords to elicit the data that you've got from the data set and looking to deliver that in a business setting, right? And then finally, the last part, which was best-selling artists and the associated risk to the business. Again, vague, right? And ultimately, our job as a data analyst is to distill this sort of vague business requirement into something that can be measured, but to be transparent about it. And it's that transparency that we really want to emphasize, because ultimately, it's an interpretation. Whilst there's data to support it, we're still making an interpretation of the business problem from the scenario and our knowledge. And therefore, at this stage, what we really want to do is make that transparent so that we can have a critical discussion with either the analytical stakeholders or even the business executives to get buy-in into our approach. Anyway, and one way of measuring this could be determining thinking about a metric like top 5 most popular artists. Obviously, this might depend on the exploratory analysis you do. This number, I've just chosen 5 because I did some exploratory analysis before this, and I thought that demonstrated a large market share of the total sales. And then measuring their share of total sales to assess the business risk, etc. So now what I'd like to do is just dissect this a little bit more to think about how we can construct this in your own work, right? So tips for how do we create an analytical objective. You can see that I've used 3 different types of emphasis here. So I've used blue text, I've used bold, and what you'll find out now is that I'm going to use some highlighting. So the first thing that I want you to pay attention to is a verb-noun structure. So when you think about defining an objective, obviously, if you can emphasize the use of action, right? So, determining, identifying, finding, that gives, a very concrete way, of it can be measured and it's clear what is intended from the language. So I think using verbs, action verbs, are a really great way of starting an objective, and analytical objectives are no different. Secondly, thinking about how can we link the analysis to the data set, right? And back to the business objective, so a business need to a metric. And so here you can notice that I'm using words that were kind of evoked in the business scenario, but that are also present in the data set, right? So that I can measure them. So things like average spend by country, or best-selling genres, share of total sales. All these things are concrete, right? Because they are referring back to the ERD, right? That data set, data model that we were given at the start. And then finally, trying to relate your metrics back to some objective, right? So relating back to the problem, why do we want to measure that or find the best-selling genre and compare popularity? It's because it's going to help us to support the delivery of tailored content across countries. Why do we want to find the top 5 most popular artists? so that we can assess the business risk and, hopefully propose some alternative strategies, right, for reducing that risk. So again, if you can think about these sorts of concepts when you construct your analysis in the first place, then you're going to make it a lot more relatable to the person who's, receiving your analytical outputs. And especially as a business stakeholder, if you are able to make that link super clear to the business objective, they're going to be on your side. Okay, so returning to the problem statement, we defined our first two parts, didn't we? So we've defined our declaring the problem, the stating of the urgency, and now we want to finish it off. So we want to link it to our analysis. And all this is really just going through the steps and showing how we can define this by the work that we've just done. So if we look at our last part, we're going to address the problems, business priorities rather, of Chinook by identifying the size. So this is the first objective that we defined, the second, and the third. And so really, what we then get to have is a concrete statement where we declare the problem, we state the urgency, and we link it to our analysis by the measuring of these concrete analytical objectives. And so that links the business scenario to the work that we're about to do. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. If you do have questions on that, I will I'll look at them in the chat now. I'm seeing Zafar, by limiting the country, we won't miss other patterns in the data. Absolutely. So this is an important point, by the way, of thinking about how do we scope an analysis? And ultimately, it depends on the time that's given to you in a project. I think the important thing to notice here is that analysis is infinite, in that we could spend the rest of our lives devoted to one single piece of analysis and would never cover everything. So when we come to define our approach to a problem, our problem statement, often what we need to do is either, we tightly define it. And so, okay, we're just going to look at country because we've done some exploratory analysis and it seems to be an interesting area of exploration. And we just say, this is, in the initial project period, we're going to be looking at just the demographics. And that's okay as long as you are very upfront with it. And, ultimately what might happen so far is that the business come back to you and say, hey, we want to know more about, the customer demographics than just the country. You need to expand this. And that's, okay, you'll have that discussion. But the point is to be really upfront and clear about what your scope is so that you can then have a conversation with the relevant stakeholders. But in terms of analysis, often what is better is to do your exploratory analysis first, find what you think are the interesting areas for exploration, and then to scope that and be clear about what you're going to be conducting, because ultimately you want to make it tightly defined, because that will make your job easier and it will make the business's job easier in terms of validating your approach, right? But obviously, yeah, exploratory analysis is an important phase. Okay, so hopefully that's answered that part of the question. Would it be possible to get this presentation to digest all the steps? Possibly, absolutely. We'll be sending the materials out afterwards for your review. So absolutely, recording too. That in mind, let's move on to the next section. So I think that was probably the meatiest in terms of how do we construct our analysis in a way that's relatable. These are some frameworks that you can use. And now we're going to talk about how we can actually move towards business-oriented analytics. So we have done a lot of hard work just now. We have looked at the case study, digested the scenario, reinterpreted it in an analytical lens. And now we're thinking about the outputs. So for an example, in the assignment that's currently being worked on by many people on the call, there are three outputs. There's the presentation, there's the report, and there are the Tableau dashboard. And so thinking about, as a business-oriented analyst, it's about how do I construct those outputs in a way that will resonate with the person reading it, in a way that maximizes the business impact. And here we're just thinking about these sorts of techniques that we can use to make my work more easily digestible and to emphasize the key messages so that the person reading it is immediately switched on and knows the objectives, right, that we're trying to get as a result of doing the analysis. So I'm going to talk about these four concepts, and then I'm going to link it to some of these frameworks that I'm recommending you use. Okay, so first thing I want you to think about is structure. So structure in the sense of, if I'm writing a report, how do I structure that in a way that's easily scannable so that if someone doesn't have much time, they can look at that and then immediately get the right um, sense or look for the information that they want to find in a very quick way. So structure is really important in order to help others to interpret our work. The second is prioritization. Again, we'll talk about this a bit more detail, but essentially, as I mentioned just as far, that sometimes we need to make hard decisions and decide, we might have 15 interesting findings, but in a presentation, of 20 minutes to a stakeholder, we need to prioritize. We can't say 15 different things because they'll forget by the time we've reached number 5. So thinking about the most important actions and prioritizing those in your outputs. The take-home message again. So once we have the key message, how do we present that in a way that is easily digestible? And then finally, visualizing what's important. So sometimes we might have this amazingly complex visualization that is really interactive, and if someone's using it on a dashboard, that might allow them to self-serve. But in a presentation, that same visualization may not get the key message home. Just need to get a sip of water. Okay. So these are the 4 concepts. What I'm going to do now is quickly move to this screen because I have the text that I'll be able to support you with here. So if we think about structuring our work, what do we want to do? We want to make sure that it's easily understandable and that people can retrieve the information that they want from that work. So if we think about a report, which is key analytical output for a lot of projects, simple things like using headings, making sure that our font size is legible, we've got paragraph spacing between our different sections, making sure that we back up our findings with evidence. So things like having a visualization from your analysis in your report so that it's clear that what you're saying resonates with the data, right? These little things really help just to help a person understand your analysis and follow along your analytical narrative. And it's that kind of narrative structure that we really want to deliver against when we think about how do we make our outputs understandable to the business. Another thing to think about, and this is particularly for analytical outputs. So imagine your Tableau dashboard or a Python script or a SQL project code that, for example, you might write one day and then you park the project for 6 months and you come back to it. Would a future version of yourself be grateful to you for the work that you've done to make your code easy to understand? And so these are little things that you can do, like removing clutter, so like calculations that don't make it into your final version of the analysis, adding code comments, for example, to help someone understand why you've taken a particular approach. And things like in Tableau, simple things just like hiding unnecessary sheets so that when I look at it, I can just see, okay, there's the dashboard. That's what I need to click, because obviously, we want to avoid that information paralysis of having too much and overload and so on. So these are just small steps that I want you to bear in mind when you think about creating and designing your outputs. The prioritization, again, little things just like making sure that you cherry pick your findings. So if you have 15, obviously think about the ones that are going to add the most business value and that are often the quick wins. And I say this just from my experience in business, is that those quick wins are gold dust because first they build your credibility with stakeholders. So a simple thing, I'm trying to think what a quick win might be, is maybe automating a report so that an analyst who is currently producing this report every week in Excel has 2 hours of extra time that they can invest in another activity that adds value, right? A quick win might be something like that, just like freeing up time. And if you can have your eye on those things of like something that's really easy to implement and adds value right away, then I would place those quite high up in, for example, a list of recommendations or in my presentation because they're easy and they help to demonstrate that you are adding value, right? And yeah, as I said, prioritizing by impact. So if you think about those things, like the most complex, you might want to prioritize lower down, but if it adds lots of value, then you might want to adjust the ordering depending on those two things about the ease of implementation and the value that it's going to add. And so obviously, if we can think of something that's really easy to implement and adds lots of value, then let's place that right up at the top of the list. And then the third message was about the key message and how do we communicate that key message in a presentation. You can see here, I'm using these sort of like verb noun descriptions again. So land your take home message. How do I frame my slides in a way that makes you remember the one thing I want you to remember? And again, so things like what is that take home message? Having a really clear idea of what you want the audience to remember at the end of a dashboard or at the end of a technical report, slide deck, whatever. Writing concisely helps, of course, because we've only got so much attention, and the more concisely we can write, the more clearly someone will understand what you are looking to do. And yeah, this verb noun sentences often help with that. And then finally, we want to think about how do we visualize this. And so after this section, in a few minutes, what I'm going to be asking you to do is to rate or to rank visualizations according to these four principles. So I'll go through that in a second, but just kind of anchor you in that thought for a second, because visualizing a take-home message is really important in the right format, like a technical report or a dashboard, or even a presentation, right? Because ultimately, it's about what's your take-home message, what do you want your audience to remember, and simplifying it if you can, because the simpler it is, the less work they have to do to figure it out, and ultimately, the less work that someone has to do is the more easy they're going to, be able to, first of all, implement it. And second of all, the more likely they'll be with you on your, in terms of supporting the project that you're on, because they can see how the ends justify the means. Okay, so I'm going to take a small pause here and I want you to steel yourself, okay? Because what we're now going to be doing is doing a little bit of a test. So I want you to think about these structures, these four concepts rather that we've just gone through. So thinking about our analytical outputs, and we're going to relate this back to the case study. And then what I'm going to be doing is showing you examples of visualizations. And I want you to tell me, based on these four concepts, which one you think is the best one that fits the scenario. I'll go through a little bit more detail. So the first thing that I want you to think about is the key findings. So obviously, because we can't do all the analysis right on the call right here, I've done the exploratory analysis for you. And after cleaning the data and the initial exploratory analysis, there are three key findings that we want to communicate. And so let's just read through these carefully. So the first one is that we found that the US is the biggest country that has the largest number of customers and the largest number of sales in Chinook. So clearly this is a key market. Second, we found that as a genre, so thinking about the genre question, rock is the best seller. And it's also the fastest growing. So it seems to be that more people are buying rock tracks through time, right? And it's an increasing trend. And the third is the top 5 best-selling artists make up 22% of all sales. So these are key findings, right? So essentially what we want to do now is create a visualization that really demonstrates this key finding without having to write it down in text. So if we can have a visualization that lands this message really well, that's going to create impact. So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to present to you 3 different options. I'm going to pause after each one. And once you have seen all 3 of them, I would like you to write down in the chat function which option you think demonstrates the analytical objective the best. So which one shows this finding the best? Hopefully that's all clear. Any thumbs up? You still with me? There we go. Getting a few now. Thank you so much. So what I'm looking for is your vote. And just to say, there's not necessarily one right answer, but there are better choices. So I'm curious to see what you guys think. Okay, let me go back to this one, sorry, because this will be a bigger screen. So we're going to look at the first example. And so remember, the question that we want, the finding we want to demonstrate is the US, well, the US is the biggest country and it has the most number of sales. Again, we've got an analytical objective at the top, just as a reminder. And this is the first option. I'm not going to say anything else. So I just want you to look at the visualization and think to yourself, does this demonstrate the key finding that the US is the largest country? Okay, you've digested that. I'm now going to move on to option 2. So we can see we've got a bar chart. We've got some countries at the bottom and the number at the top. So that's option 2. And then we've got option 3. So option 3 is a tree map that shows the different proportions and the counts of customers by continent and country. So if you vote down 1, 2, or 3 in the chat function, I'm curious to see what your thoughts are, see if we get a majority vote on which one you feel is the one that answers the business key finding the best. Cool. I'm getting 1s. Mostly I'm getting 2s. The scale is unclear. Yeah, so let's think about this. One thing that I really like about maps is obviously it's very relatable. We all know what the world looks like, Google Maps. And it makes it easy to spot geographical patterns in context, right? But one of the downsides is that sometimes it overcomplicates really simple data, right? Like the finding here is that we want to show that the US has the most number of customers and high sales, right? And if I'm looking at this immediately, I don't get that, right? I can see that, the US and Canada seems to be in the blue color, but there's no annotation on the chart. Larger areas of the map have more emphasis because they take up more geographical space, but that might not necessarily be in congruence with our key finding. So this is something just to bear in mind. So I would say it's probably overcomplicating a little bit. Option 2, I think there's definitely ways we can improve this, right? But for at least what we have is the US on the left, and it clearly has the biggest spike, right? So we can definitely see that the US is the country with the most number of customers. But then a potential downside is that it doesn't immediately show the average spend. It doesn't show, it shows a lot of information. So for example, we might want to group like all these European countries under one banner, or just to show you the US in relation to the average share. But at least what we have here is a clear spike. It's ordered. So we've sorted the data from highest to lowest, and it's clear that the US is at top. So at the moment, I'm leaning towards 2. And then 3. Now, I think 3 is an interesting one. It's probably a little bit confusing because we're showing 2 different concepts here. We're showing continents and we're showing countries. I think at first glance, you don't get a clear message. But the benefit of this, and I'll show you in the dashboard at the end of the session, is that you can interact with this. And obviously, what the test now is not about interactivity, it's about which one shows the best finding. But I would say if it were up to me, I don't think 1 is a good option because I think the map doesn't actually show us the information. I think 2 is much better, and I think 3 could be good with a bit of more development or a bit more thought. So I think you guys are pretty much on the right track. So I'd say 2 or 3 as the main visualization that supports the finding. Okay. So yeah, we talked about all those different points now, and I'm now going to move on to the second question. So I hope you're ready on your keyboards, and I'm going to move on to the analytical objective 2. So reminding ourselves that we wanted to find the best-selling genre and popularity across different countries. And so I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm just going to show you each option. So option one. Okay. So we can see we've got genre, we've got country, and the number of, or the total number of sales, total sales by those genres and countries. The next one, option two, we also have country and genre, and don't know if you can see that on my screen actually. It's the average sales that are being shown. So average sales in the data annotation and the total sales that are being shown in the length of the bar. And then the final one, option three, again, three different types of bar charts. You can see here that we have also shown country and sales rather, by genre, but we've included some filters. For anyone, please vote now. Which one do you think recommends supports the finding about which genre is best selling and by which country? Cool. Getting a lot of votes in. Thank you very much, guys. I think option three seems to be by far and away the winner. And I agree. I think let's just walk through each of these options and about what the benefits and disadvantages are. So if we look at option one, I think clearly this is not very good. The reason for this is you can't read any of the countries because they all overlap. There's too much information. I think there's too many data points that, whilst there might be an argument for like a self-service sort of platform about this sort of display. When you come to demonstrate a key finding in a presentation, this is not going to cut it because it doesn't back up your finding. It's too complicated. Doesn't support the message. Option two, I think, has some advantages, right? In the sense that we're sorting the data. So it's clear that the US is on top. We're also showing other metrics. So we are not only showing the amount spent because obviously the US has the most customers, but we might also be interested in finding out which ones spend the most on average, right? And so this is sharing this information as well. However, we get this duplication of text, right? You can see like genre, everything is rock. Do we really need this? We could probably replace this with a title, right, to make this a little bit easier to read. And I think another point might be also the it can kind of oversimplify some of the relationships. So I think number three is probably the best bit. I think first of all, because one, it has a very clear title. And I think text is a really important thing on a visualization, because ultimately what we want to show is that the data supports the key finding. And the key finding is that rock is dominating all sales across all locations. And so you can kind of see that, by comparing France by Germany and, the relationships within each country by those different genres. So I think the fact that it has a clear title, the fact that it's sorted and that rock's at the top, again, there might be improvements that we can make to it. But I would say overall, it allows us to have a little bit better of an idea about what the finding is because we communicate it with a clear title. Okay. And then finally, guys, I'm going to move on to the final objective three. So again, this is to do with the risk profile. So determining the top five popular artists and trying to assess the business risk. So the key finding, if we remind ourselves, was that 22% of the top five, also the top five artists make up 22% of overall sales. So how can we represent this? Option one. So we can see that we've got blue represents the top five artists. The gray means everyone else. And we have date on the bottom and the various percentages by each quarter, right? So the percentage of sales that were conducted by the top five or the other artists. Okay, let's move on to option two. So a simple pie chart. I will say no more. And option three. So option three here is a bar chart that seems to have a little bit more information about who those artists are and their proportion of sales that they make up. Any thoughts? Please write it down in the chat. Let's see what you think. Interesting. Good. So I'm pleased that no one saying one. We've got lots of threes and a fair amount of twos. So a bit of a split here. So let's look back on each visualization and critique the benefits and positives, right? So I think at the moment, this visualization, I think is doing too much. So whilst date is a useful concept in a time series, for a key finding, which is we just want to figure out, show that 22% of sales are basically owned by the top 5 artists, right? By adding date, we're complicating this message because there's so many different trends that are going on and different variation that we're not getting an idea of that 22%, right? And so I think we're doing a little bit too much in this visualization. For that reason, I don't think it demonstrates the key finding. Option 2 is very simple. And I think in sometimes, very simple is very good because it demonstrates that the key 22% figure is clear that's the top 5 artists from the legend. If anything, it's a little bit too simplistic. It doesn't involve any additional information, but given that the key finding is just it's the 22%, I think this is also a good option. Potentially in a dashboard, what we could do is use kind of a drill down functionality where you might click on the little quarter of the pie chart, and then that could give you another more detailed view, such as a table or even option 3. So I think option 3 is a good option. I think it gives a little bit more context than option 2 because we not only show the percentages, but we show which artists make those up. And at the same time, we have a little bit more extra information. But then again, we're kind of providing surplus information to the original ask. Yeah. So I think, well, it depends what, yes, Adelina is saying of the question. The question is to determine who are the 5 most popular, and only option 3 provides this. So I think you're kind of right in that sense, is that the top 5 could be considered as one group and a percentage of 22%. I guess it depends on your interpretation of the question, doesn't it? In my reading of it, I can see your point of view, right? Which is that it gives you more context, not only the top 5 is like 20%, but who are those artists, right? So that we can actually figure out, oh, do we need to speak to their agent, or do we need to renegotiate a contract, or do we need to look, if the majority of them seem to be rock artists, can we diversify our portfolio so that the rock listeners in Europe might want we adjust our risk potentially by diversifying. So these are all sorts of things that would then come from this information as a result of knowing the top 5. So Martha's also saying, what's this? But without 2, 3, you might only be 5% of total, so not that significant. And again, these are all like detailed questions that we can think about. I think the most important thing here is considering the take-home message, and ultimately, that is something that you as an analyst are going to need to consider, because it's only your interpretation, and that's going to form your narrative, right? Obviously, you're going to want to make that as objective as possible. But by simplifying that message, I think the key kind of repetitive point that I kind of want to drive through here is that if you can simplify your visualization to be in accordance with your message, then you're more likely to be able to influence the people at the end of the call, because they will see how the data backs up your thought. Okay, hopefully you found that a fun exercise. Again, some of the charts I would say controversial in the sense that there's not always one clear answer. But I think the key thing that I want you to start thinking about is that critique about what is your take-home message? Does the visualization back it up? Can we remove or take away or add anything that will allow the user to better understand that take-home message? And if you can think along those lines, and in general, I'd say simplicity is a good principle to adhere to, then I think you're in for a good chance of landing your message with even greater impact. All right, so we're going to move on to the last part of the questions. If you do have Any more questions that we go through, please do write them down on the chat function, and then I'll be taking those up at the end. But maybe I'll just double check that I don't have any that are outstanding. Again, yeah, there's a few that are outstanding, but I'll address those at the end because I think they're slightly more generic questions. So I want to start now by finishing, well, the penultimate section of the presentation is thinking about how do we tell a story in a data setting. And so there's some techniques that I'd like to share with you that I think you'll find useful. So I think the first thing that I want you to understand is who is your audience? And so depending on your context, like if you're depending on the company you work for, the audience will change, right? In the assignments, one thing that I will say again is it's useful to kind of assume that you're going to have some non-technical stakeholders in the room. So let me just move on to the next thing. So the first thing that you'd want to do in a relation to the assignment that we're talking about here, so a case study situation, is to read the scenario, right? And to see in the scenario, does it give me any clues about who are the people that are responsible for the projects on the business side? Who are the stakeholders I might be working with? Are they likely to be technical or non-technical? Again, unless if it's really clearly stated in a scenario, and in general, unless if you know exactly who's going to be attending your presentation in a business setting, I think it's always best to assume that you're going to have non-technical people in the audience. So what does that mean? It means that when you come to think about how do you design your story, you should think about reducing unnecessary technical detail because that will obscure your take-home message, right? And I'll talk about this a little bit more. And then the final point about considering your audience and really think about how do you drive a story is ultimately to remember to sell it, right? Because when you are conducting analysis, when you're doing a project, the end goal is that you influence a business decision. If you believe that your analysis is going to be of value, right? You might have an end decision that is actually this project was very useful and we have no conclusions. Sure, if your output is that, then you should be honest. But ultimately, what you'll typically find is that there are trends and that, with the right angling, you can design your message in a way that is more likely to be received well. And so again, just those little things that I'll talk about, like technique for presentations and so on, are really important to helping you sell your message. And I'll talk about it in a bit. So it's going to use an example of a story arc framework about how, you might choose to design a presentation, right? And I think the first thing that you will hopefully see some echoing of the same themes here is starting with the context, setting the scene. So if you think about how did we start this presentation, we started with the problem statement, right? So we thought about how do we construct the link to the analysis from the business scenario, and how do we drive the impact by stating the urgency, declaring the problem, and writing our analytical objectives. So these are all things that you can use to hopefully anchor your audience in the reason that they should listen to your presentation. So explaining what's at stake is a really important way of getting people's attention, because ultimately people are busy, they've all got lives outside of their jobs and the presentation that they attend and so on. And your responsibility is to get them to listen and anchoring them to those important shared understandings about what the problem is will help you to get that message across. Again, so what you might do, depending on the assignment you do or the presentation that you are giving, you'll have some sort of analytical output that you'd want to present. In the first assignment of the Career Accelerator that many of you guys will be working on, that takes the form of a dashboard demo. Obviously, depending on your output, that might be slightly different, but I'll just use this as an example. So the idea is that we've set the scene, we have explained what the purpose of our analysis is, and the next point would then be to show or give a bit more information about what we have found. And typically, using something like a dashboard or an output that is crafted to give a message and that has visualizations and appeal from an aesthetic perspective is a powerful tool, right? Because that will help you to explain the insight, to link it back to the priorities, and to show that it's based in evidence. So first step is, set the scene, then, give it more context, reveal some insights, and then what next? Again, you might want to do this whilst you do the demo as well, but just to highlight this as a take-home message is that you want to show those key findings. So in a dashboard, you might have a key finding that, rock seems to be the genre that we should invest in because it has the most sales and it's the fastest growing. So we might design our dashboard if we were presenting this in such a way that that was a really clear message, that is a very clear message. How can you do this? If you're not using a dashboard, you might want to consider designing slides. So using things like prioritizing by impact, so the most important find first, using visual aids, so like a chart or a clear descriptive title that tells the audience what that finding is. These are all really good ways of delivering this, and I'll give you some examples later. And then finally, the next step. So I think this is often the part that people neglect the most. And for me, it's the most important part of a presentation is you've done all the hard work, you've done the analysis, you've created those key findings. And essentially the question you want to answer now is, okay, so what do I do about it? As a business stakeholder, what do you want me to do? You've convinced me that there's a problem. How do I solve it? Or what actions do I need to take? And trying to make these actions as specific, as understandable as possible, and as relevant to the business objectives as possible will make sure that you land your message with impact. And again, we'll touch on this a little bit later. But this is just an example of how you can use a story arc to structure, for example, a presentation or even a demo. Okay, so just thinking about the slides here. So this is just a point I wanted to highlight. I'll talk about this a little bit more as well in the next few slides, but this is an example of a slide that I think is good because it has a clear take-home message, which is delivered in the slide title, and it has a visualization that supports that message, right? So the idea is that you want to make the message as simple as possible and have that message supported by a visualization. So I'll show you a few more examples. So this is something that I've taken from an online source about tooth decay in adults, right? And I think some concepts that I think are really good in designing good slides are one, like reducing clutter, so not having that much text, and two, using visual aids. So I've just got a question for you. I mean, do you think that I put a big red X here? Obviously, I think that's a little bit harsh, but what do you think are maybe some of the points that could be improved about the way this slide is presented? Thinking about those concepts that we've just talked about. Any thoughts in the chat function? Yeah, Savar saying, yeah. Reduce text. I think that's definitely something that I'd look to do, is where we have lots of text on the left-hand side and even on the visualization, and it's kind of not immediately clear what the key finding is. Yeah, there's some other points we talk about, like font size, reducing the text. I think potentially the colors we could revisit. For me, text is a big one, but I think also looking at the slide title, it's like I'm reading an academic text. I don't see how this tells me the key finding. And ultimately, I think the layout is a little bit distracting from that message. So how can we improve this? Removing grid lines might be an example. How can we improve this? So again, this is the same source, the same information, but just reformatted into a slightly different way. And I think this is, again, not necessarily perfect, but I think it's a lot better because we have a very clear title that says the main finding. Vulnerable groups are much more likely to have untreated tooth decay. And we're highlighting those vulnerable groups through the use of emphasis, right? The visualization is taking up a lot more space. and we have clear text that defines the various charts and what is a vulnerable group and whatnot. Again, we could improve maybe by removing grid lines. I agree with that comment. But I think in general, it's a much more clear what that key finding is. Okay, so that's just an example about how we can construct our slides in a way that simplifies our message and hopefully lands it with a greater impact. And I'm just going to finish now with the last section. Probably take me 5 minutes, and then we can open up the floor to broader questions, right? I just wanted to think about recommendations. So I did talk about the next steps as being the most important kind of thing, the crucial center point of your presentation. So how can we deliver this in a way that adds value? As I mentioned, recommendations are the end goal. Typically, when you present something in industry, you're going to want to have some sort of action as a result. You're going to know the sorts of things that should be done, but you want to get the buy-in to do them. And so creating recommendations that drive impact and that are very, weighted in analysis and very specific will help you to achieve that aim. So I use this 3-step framework that I think really helps in understanding what goes into a good recommendation. And you'll recognize some of these from other frameworks too. But I like to say, what makes a good recommendation? A good recommendation is a SIC recommendation. And SIC is the acronym here. So let's just talk about the first, the specific. I think this is probably the most important one. It's very easy to give a generic statement about, we should invest more in the US because it seems to be a very fast-growing genre. Oh, sorry, not genre, fast-growing country, with more customers being on board. That is, useful in a sense, but it's not very specific. We should invest, right? So avoid general statements. And if you can, when you're giving an analysis, you should weight your statements using the metrics that you have conducted. And I think the better you can do this, the more convincing and the more measured your statements will be. So being specific. Yeah, essentially, I think Abhijit is saying smart recommendation is very similar to this concept, but just thinking about how we can apply this in a business setting, right? So implementable, another thing, is from the scenario, from the business that we work in, are these steps actually implementable? Like, for example, it's very easy to say, oh, let's invest more in so and so. But as you all know, working in a business, there is never infinite money. There's always constraints. So I think it's very reasonable to assume in a assignment case study scenario like you'll find in the Career Accelerator that those same constraints will exist. So there's always going to be no money. There's going to be limited resources to actually implement your work. So, whilst it might be the best thing ever to, build like an AI generated web app that will answer all the business questions, that will cost a lot of money. And also there's a lot of unanswered questions about what that should look like. So think about what you're really saying and can that really be implemented? And is it feasible within the constraints of the scenario? And then finally, how do we then ground this? We want to make it context aware. So thinking about the business scenario. So for example, the fact that Chinook is a music industry and a company working in the music industry, doing a bit of research around the music industry, we might want to think about common factors that are affecting the industry and therefore integrate that perhaps in some of our recommendations, right? So adapt it to the target audience as well. So depending on your audience, if it's a senior audience, then obviously you might want to go less on the technical side. If it's analytical, then you might want to focus more. And yeah, acknowledging limitations where they need to be acknowledged. Okay, and we're almost at the end, guys. I just wanted to do, well, this last slide and then a final one about how do we actually construct this and do a thought exercise with you. So we can, I think, make the most compelling recommendations by combining all these different things about our analysis. So I think the more that we ground it in truth, in specific analytical evidence, the more likely you're going to be able to sell it to the business, right? Because it's specific, it's very difficult to argue against. And this helps you to tell a story. So I've just given an example here. If we had these three different metrics that we're looking at in our case study, so the top 5 artists, which genre sold best, and demographics. And if we can almost like think about how we can integrate all these things within reason into an objective, that also helps to combine the impact. So just thinking about putting that quantitative evidence use KPIs into a recommendation so that it's more compelling to the person that's reading it. And yeah, taking these things together is often more impactful than doing it in isolation. So, worked example. I'm going to start with a concept that makes sense according to the analysis that we've done. So, for example, we have figured out that there's a large percentage of artists are, well, how to say it, the top 5 artists take up a decent chunk of the market share of sales. And perhaps in order to reduce our exposure, we might want to consider promoting more, up and coming artists on like the website or on our various platforms that we have as Chinook, the business, right? And that concept, promote mid-tier artists, has value, right? But by itself, if I tell the business we should promote mid-tier artists, is this useful? And I would say it's not very useful. I don't think it's a good example of a recommendation because there's so many unanswered questions. It's not rooted in analysis. I think that's the first negative aspect because we've done all this work and we're saying we should promote mid-tier artists, but we're not saying why, or we're not justifying it or contextualizing it in our analysis. And so I think we can do better. So how can we do better? Let's think about, those objectives that or the framework we can use. So specific, implementable, context aware. So how can we make this a bit more specific? So we talked about, potentially advertising, promoting these artists on some sort of a platform. So we can make an assumption, like based on the scenario, that they're going to have a website, and we could choose to increase, advertising spend on promotions for trending mid-tier artists in order to, help with the risk distribution. This is a lot better because I think it's a lot more specific about what needs to be done or a suggestion. It doesn't necessarily need to be the only suggestion, right? It's an interpretation. And I think obviously you're using your intellect here and your awareness of the business and all these other things to come up with something specific. But I think the most important thing here is that the more specific you are, even if it's not the thing that gets implemented at the end of the day, the more convincing it is and the more likely that you will start a conversation from it. And so, they might say, well, hang on, no, our website isn't very well visited. What we need to do is go to the app instead, or, promote it on the app store or whatever. These things are really helpful to actually start that conversation. And then another kind of better way, into thinking about that concept that we thought about before of how do we make that even stronger in terms of how it's connected to our analysis. Spotlight mid-tier rock artists in, our web campaigns, targeted at European customers, because we saw that Europe was actually one of the fastest growing areas from one of the visualizations, so that we can stabilize sales against top 5 artist volatility. And again, I've given a quantitative goal here. Again, I don't think that's strictly necessary, but it just shows that you are willing and able to think about the implementation of your analysis and drive that measurability of it. So, you're thinking about the fact that it can be measurable. Obviously, 22 to 18%, that's just something I've just taken from the scenario and then applied maybe some critical thinking to it, but doesn't necessarily have to be, it's not like the most grounded thing ever. We might want to provide more justification for that in a later analysis. But the point is that I'm making stronger links to our scenario from the analysis that I've done. So if you can create that narrative that's based in the analysis that you've done, that's going to make your recommendations even more impactful. And I think as a general rule, what I'd recommend and what I'd much prefer to see from any presentation is a couple of recommendations at the end that are really well developed and is really clear that they have been driven from the analysis you've conducted, rather than maybe 6 or 7 recommendations that are like promote mid-tier artists, invest more in rock, blah, 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 blah. That, might be useful as a bullet point for a slide to then discuss. But ultimately, when you come to influence a business decision, you're going to need to have much more evidence to support an investment of money, right? And I think it's that evidence that the business is going to be looking for when you come to present at the end of your project. So hopefully that's been a useful thought exercise. I do have the slides at the end, and this is an example of another objective that you could take as an idea to prioritize marketing spend in the US. How can I convert that into a better, more sick recommendation using the framework that we've just gone through? So I'll leave that to you to do in your own time. But that concludes the end of the presentation, guys. So I appreciate you sticking around with me for so long. It is a lot of content to cover, but I'm hoping that you really, well, this has given me a few tools, right, to think about, well, how can I frame my analysis in a way that can actually be digested by someone that's never looked at it before? And I think the more that you can think about your audience in your outputs, the more convincing you're going to be as an analyst, because ultimately that's the aim of the game, right? To influence business decision making, and that's why we are data analysts, and that's why we're hired. So I hope that's been useful. If there are any questions, I'll take those now. I know that some of you have been answering questions on the poll, which has been great. I think Martha, I've just looked at yours. Do you have a rule of thumb for number of slides for a standard presentation? You know what? I don't have a rule of thumb. My preference would be that you have when we're talking about the best practices to engender, thinking about like reducing the amount of really detailed text on a slide, my preference would be to have more slides, but less density of information on them than thinking about too many slides in a presentation. Because I think ultimately it's just about how well you cover your point in the time available to you. So in an assignment setting, you might have a time limit, right? So you might have only 8 minutes to deliver your presentation in. And therefore, you might want to reduce the number of slides. So I think just taking that context with the scenario that you're delivering your presentation in, but in general, think about information density as a better way, I would say, of generating slides, and how do you design them in a way that your message can be clearly received. Sorry, Gabriel did answer a question quite at the start. He's saying, "Good afternoon, Harry. Could you please share some of the sources of large public data that you sometimes use for analysis when a business doesn't have a large database of its own?" Again, it depends on your area of where your industry is. My background is in the NHS, so I used to work in healthcare analytics and then in consultancy for afterwards. And I would say I can definitely share like the NHS digital website is one that I use a lot for doing healthcare analyses of, say, appointments by GP practice, which will be another assignment that we'll look at in course 2, by the way, guys. But there's lots of useful public sources of information on either the ONS, so the Office for National Statistics, or if you're interested in healthcare, like my background is NHS Digital. So I'd say that's a great way of doing, for example, your own projects, for example, based on actual statistics that are released, that are used for decision making, right? Let's go. So I'm trying to think. So there's a few more questions. I know there's some comments in the chat, so great. For framing analyses, why do you need a fishbone diagram? So you don't necessarily need a fishbone. It's just the idea of a problem-solving framework. This is probably more applicable for case studies that are done in relation to the course content, right? Because as I said, a fishbone problem-solving statement is something that you might use in workshops or a tool to get answers to business questions that in reality, you might get those answers just by talking to people. But obviously in a case study scenario, you can't talk to anyone. So what we are really looking for is your ability to take a scenario and provide an angle on it. So to really give it structure, and a problem-solving statement helps you, or a framework like a fishbone diagram or 5 whys, helps you to, first of all, structure your thoughts, think about what the business really wants, and connect that to your analysis. So I think it's that broad concept of linking your analysis to the business objective that I really want you to think about. Shamistha. So hopefully that answers that question. Any more questions? One question that I always get lost in whilst writing presentations is knowing exactly which charts to use. Is there any reference site to be used? I know that there is often standardized formats that one uses. Again, yeah, this is a great point. It's something that we do cover on the course. But I would say in terms of external sources, I think that the Financial Times are a really great source of information there. Like when it critically acclaimed their data visualization department, and they've come up with some good standardized guides. Equally, if I'm touting my own trumpet, when I worked in the NHS, I designed a style guide for charts types and how do you select a chart type based on the information you've given. And there are sources on the NHS website that I could certainly point to, or on GitHub if you look at my GitHub profile, but a repository where I host that information. So again, there's lots of content out there. I just advise that yeah, you perhaps look at the Financial Times or the NHS website for that information. Yeah, absolutely. I'll be sharing the slides afterwards. And I'm going to do last poll of questions. I think most of the questions I'm seeing, option 3 poor because the overall percentage was confused for the last 3 options exercises. I think that's an argument, right? I think that was related to the risk profile. So I think it depends on your messaging. So absolutely, if the message is just what are the top 5, what percentage of sales were conducted by the top 5 artists, then the pie chart makes sense. But there was another interpretation of the question where you could think about who were actually those top 5 artists, and therefore having that artist name might be useful. Again, these are all like not necessarily ideal answers. These are just different approaches to a question. So you might choose to like pick and mix with, I really like the fact that the pie chart was a high level, easy to understand concept, but then I might combine that with, including the artist names in the pie chart. And obviously that's something that you can think about when you come to design your visualizations. So yeah, it's not prescriptive. Obviously there's positives or negatives for everything. And I think it's just up to you to consider which visualizations best have the most number of positives for you. Okay, guys, I hope that has been really helpful. I'm going to conclude the call there. We'll be sharing the slides after the session. And if you do have any questions, you can reach out to me either via email or, for those of you, for booking one-to-one facilitator sessions on the course, that's what we're here to do, to help. So, as you come to deliver your assignments, we're happy to provide advice and that sort of thing. So I'll conclude it there. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you liked it. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon. And for those prospective students, hopefully seeing you on the next cohort. So bye-bye for now. And yeah, best of luck for the future.